This podcast is powered by Acast.
How are you doing there? It is time for the podcast. And John, we are doing that podcast we promised the listeners on Africa. The second in our series on Africa. I am in an amazing place, John. Actually, I think it's one of the most beautiful places I've ever been. It's called Franschhoek in the Western Cape, about an hour outside Cape Town at the Franschhoek Literary Festival. They've been working me hard. I've done 5 gigs back to back.
5? Wow.
I wrecked.
Well, there's 5 books sold anyway.
There's 5 books sold out. Books sold out at the festival.
Nice.
Absolutely.
Well done.
So that's great. No, they've been incredibly receptive, unbelievably friendly people, South Africans.
Yeah.
Really friendly people.
Yeah.
This place, when I say beautiful, it is a valley in the most extraordinary mountain range. Everything, the architecture, the food, the people are such beautiful people.
Yeah.
And multiracial, all sorts of things going on. But yesterday, John, I did a gig in the main church in the village of Franschhoek, which is in the Dutch Reformed Church, right? And if you've ever done a gig in a Dutch Reformed church, right?
No, I haven't. Not yet, anyway.
Right, okay. But it's like a big one. Like it's about 400 people there, right?
Wow,
But
okay.
the amazing thing is there's absolutely no evidence of any ornamentation at all. It is so
How do you mean?
austere. So the Dutch Reformed Church was the really extreme form of Calvinist church that the people here worshipped in and still
Right.
worship in, right?
Mm.
They're quite religious, these people. And it's so austere. So their whole idea was no idolatry. You
Right.
couldn't have any images of Jesus or Mary or any images of anything in the church because that is idolatry. And actually the whole idea for their approach to Christianity is the direct relationship between you and God, not mediated by anyone at all. So you go into this church and it's so austere, beautiful. You'd love it though. The Sandman, lovely acoustics, John. Lovely acoustics.
Do you know, that's my thing. Everywhere I go into the church. I always seek out cathedrals and churches just to hear what they sound like because they're the most beautiful sounding buildings usually.
Well, this was an amazing place. But anyway, I was talking there and it got me thinking about the people who settled here. The Europeans who settled here were French Huguenots. And Franschhoek means French corner in Dutch.
Right.
So what happened was French Huguenots came here because remember we were talking about the wine routes and why they're so good at wine?
Yeah.
Because these people brought what they called their viniculture from France.
Yeah,
and they realized that this part of the world was amazing for growing wine. So the question is, who were these people? Why did they come here? When did they come here? And who are they now? Right? Because
Can you answer any of those?
it's a massive, of course, John, we'll try to. It's a massive part. Now, we're going to talk today about South Africa. We're going to be talking to Pumi Mashigo in a couple of minutes. And she interviewed me last week on her podcast. Fascinating woman. We'll talk about politics. What the background noise is the following, John. Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of South Africa, is meeting Donald Trump tomorrow in the White House.
Yes.
And this meeting is a pivotal meeting because South Africa is moving towards China and India and away from America. Not only that, but obviously Donald Trump called all of Africa a shithole the first time he was in, and he's cut off US aid, right? He has cut off all sorts of connections between South Africa and America ahead of the G20. He has, we heard last week, embraced the Afrikaners as a race that is now a refugee race.
Yeah.
And he is essentially trying to squeeze South Africa, probably because, or in addition to South Africa's proximity to Russia, because the ANC were Soviet-backed, but also because of South Africa's position in the International Court of Justice against Israel. So there's loads going on, John.
There was a great shot of one of the 59 Afrikaners arriving in America. Huge, fat guy with a big beard. And the caption was, one of the lucky Afrikaners escaping poverty and starvation. And he comes rolling down the steps.
Well, in fairness now here, the reaction to this has been one across the board. Whites, blacks, Afrikaners, English speakers, whatever. They're just rolling their eyes at this. They just cannot
Right.
understand. But we'll talk to Pumi about it in a couple of minutes. But it is a huge global story. But let me come back to the Dutch-speaking people here.
Yeah.
Fascinatingly, the French-speaking Huguenots who set up this settlement here in Franschhoek and all the farms and all the valleys around here became Dutch speakers, as Dutch was the official language of the Cape settlement. And the reason is, why did the Dutch end up here? Right? Why did the Dutch come to South Africa in the
Mm.
first place? The Dutch came to South Africa in the first place because they were not interested in Africa. They were interested in the spice routes of Borneo and Indonesia and
Right.
India. So when the Dutch went around the Cape of Good Hope, just down the road here, they were headed to the riches of Asia. They had nothing and no real interest in Africa
Yeah.
until they found gold here many, many, many centuries later. But we're talking they came here in the early 17th century, like 1605, 1602, 1610,
Yeah.
those sort of times. And do you remember we talked about the Dutch East India Company?
Yeah. That was the biggest company ever, you said before.
It was the biggest company ever by terms of its capital base. It was bigger than Apple.
Wow.
So the
Wow.
Dutch East India Company was set up in 1602. And the reason they set up the Dutch East India Company was navigating from Holland all the way to Borneo was incredibly, incredibly risky. You could lose everything. So they set
Mm.
up this company that issues shares to normal Dutch people to have a bit of a stake in the final landing of goods in Amsterdam. So in this way, the Dutch kind of created a shareholder democracy. They soldered the interests of the company onto the interests of the king and the people. And
Right.
we've done it before. We've spoken about the extraordinary monetary innovation of the Dutch in early 17th century Amsterdam, and they were in Ireland. They were all over the place because this was
Mm.
King Billy, all those sort of things. But a fascinating part of the story was they set up a colony here in order to feed the ships. So it took 2 to 4 months to get from Amsterdam to the tip of Africa. And
Right.
when they arrived in the tip of Africa, they were full of scurvy. They had no
Yeah.
fresh fruit. They had nothing. They had no vitamins. They were vitamin deficient. And they set up these Cape farming colonies to basically feed and restock and resupply the ships that then left here and went to Borneo and
Yeah.
went to Indonesia and went to India. So this was like a refueling station
Yeah. And of course,
for
South
these
Africa
people.
was just after one of the worst parts of the journey, which is the coast of Namibia. It's called the Skeleton Coast.
Is it?
Yeah, it's where the Namib Desert meets the sea. And basically, it's really treacherous because there's lots of shallow sandbars, and then they get a lot of fog and storms and all that kind of stuff. So it's notoriously treacherous. And like thousands of ships were lost there over the years. So once they got past that, then they hit South Africa.
Which is why this place is called the Cape of Good Hope. Because if you had
Yes,
actually made
exactly.
it this far, you're fine. So why did the French come here? This is the interesting thing. So the French Huguenots, remember we did our little trip to Geneva. I think it was last year, maybe the year before,
Mm,
and we did a little piece on the French Huguenots, right? The
yeah,
French Huguenots are the people here, which is why if you look at so many South African names, you know, Dupreys, Dutoit, Jordan, Villiers, Charlies Theron, John, just been another
yeah,
one,
yeah, yeah.
Duplessis, de Klerk, Cronje, these are all original French names. And
Yeah.
these are the French Huguenots. And why did they come here? Because they were oppressed in France. The history of the Huguenots is fascinating. Throughout the 16th century, France was absolutely divided in a religious war, a bit like Germany. So the
Mm,
Calvinists, Protestants, the Huguenots against the Catholics. And it was exactly the same sort of sectarian war that happened all over Europe. But the French eventually got fed up of the Huguenots. And in 1598, they signed a treaty which said, we will leave the Huguenots alone, they can be grand. But
right.
throughout the next couple of decades, the Huguenots started to get far too powerful. Why? Because they were very good at manufacturing, they were very good at banking, and they
Mm.
were extremely skilled artisans. And they were also these very Puritan religious people who basically put a huge store in money and hard work and being ethical and all that sort of stuff, right?
Hang on,
And
hang on. So being ethical, but these are the fellows who turned into the Afrikaners who
they
oppressed the.
are.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about this. This is amazing
Yeah.
thing. So they were very much, we have a relationship with God.
Yeah.
These are the settlers, not unlike some of the settlers in Northern Ireland. They're the same they're coming from the same DNA, right?
Sure.
They're settler Protestant sects and tribes, and they've also the schisms within them, but essentially they were the alternative to Catholicism. Now, of course, the French get fed up with them after a while, and there's a thing called the Edict of Fontainebleau, 1685, was an
Right.
edict that banned Huguenots from France, right?
Yeah.
And they had been persecuted, they had been murdered, they had been hunted down all over France, they had been spied on, they'd been burned at the stake. So 160,000 Huguenots left France in 10 years, which is a phenomenal amount.
Yeah.
Between 6,000 and 8,000 of them came to Ireland, which is a huge part of the
Yeah.
population.
Yeah.
So your friend Frank Lamass is one of them, right? All
Yes.
those
Yeah.
names like Lamass and Delamere, Delahunty, all these names are all Huguenot
Yeah.
names, right?
Yeah.
And they settled here, and they were unbelievably industrious.
Yeah.
And they arrived here, and they turned this place, with the help of slaves, John, into
Yeah, of
the
course.
kind of the garden of the Dutch Republic. And it was also became the garden of the British Empire, because what happened was these people fed the British ships that were coming down and around on the passage to India before the Suez Canal opened in 1872. So there's a huge backstory of history here. And then, of course, as you said, they morphed into Dutch-speaking Afrikaners, but they were Afrikaners who weren't from the Dutch DNA. They were Afrikaners from the French DNA. But also, I met a fella yesterday called Yanni O'Kennedy, who could hardly speak English, and he was an Irish Afrikaner. Right? So
What was his story?
his story is just, now this is fascinating, that the Irish married Afrikaners. Why? Because the British regarded the Afrikaners after the Boer War and before the Boer War as beneath them. So in the
Right.
hierarchy, the English
Yeah.
were top dogs, and the paddies who came down were lumped in with the Afrikaners. So there's loads and loads of Irish names who are actually Dutch speakers who are
Yeah.
Afrikaners. It's an amazing story.
That's great.
And
That is great.
so Johnny O'Kennedy could hardly speak English. I swear to God.
Shout out to Johnny.
So that is where we are. But the issue is, what you see in the history of this country is it's always been a bit of a pawn, John. It's a pawn of the Portuguese, a pawn of the Dutch, a pawn of the Brits. Now, and this is what we want to focus on today, it is the jewel in Africa. It's the biggest economy in Africa. It's one of the most productive places in Africa. What happens in Joburg dictates a lot of what happens in sub-Saharan Africa. It's very much the leader of Africa. And now, of course, it is caught in a crossfire between Donald Trump's America and your friends, John, the BRICS.
Yes.
China, India, and Russia. And that's what I want to talk about now, because there's a massive meeting this week, which will probably dictate the future of Africa for the next couple of years. And it's happening tomorrow. So why don't we talk to somebody who knows about this, great South African commentator, Pumi Mashigo. She's in Joburg. I met her last week. And let's talk to Pumi and see what is at stake. Last week in Joburg, I was doing, as you know now, a little book tour, and I had a wonderful, wonderful conversation with our next guest, Pumi Mashigo, who presents the Leveling Up podcast on a podcast syndicate called Podcast Party in Joburg. Now, we were talking about my book, we got into all sorts of stuff, and this week is a massive week for South Africa. Why? Because Cyril Ramaphosa, who I didn't know, but they affectionately call Cupcake, which is a very unusual name for a president.
I didn't know that.
But Cupcake is meeting the man with the orange face in Washington. Cyril Ramaphosa is meeting Donald Trump tomorrow in Washington. First African leader to meet Trump. There's lots of beef between these two countries. This is a really serious bellwether meeting about how America sees what you would call the global south. So there's lots to discuss. So, Pumi, how are you? Lovely to see you.
It's always, I'm in love with you. John, you don't know this, but I'm in love with David.
It's all coming out now.
If he wasn't here with his wife, I'd keep him
This is all music to my ears. I'm telling you, John. So you just have to get down to South Africa, man.
Yeah,
It's
I'm missing it
going
all,
on.
clearly.
Now, Pumi, your enduring affection, which I accept absolutely, unreservedly. Tell me, why is the leader of the biggest nation in Africa called and responds to the name Cupcake?
Like with any good politician, there's a salacious scandal linked to this. So
Excellent.
when he
We
was
love
the
that.
deputy president and his path to the presidency was quite clear, there was a scandal that came out with texts, sexts, as they call them, the youngsters. And in there, he was referred to by a younger lady. And this has kind of fallen into the recesses of the minds of South Africans, right?
Right.
And he was referred to in those messages as Cupcake. And
I love it. I
and
love
then
it.
South Africa, we have wicked senses of humor here, right? And
Yes.
a very short memory. So we forget some of the reasons why these things are and why it's actually not a good thing, right? And so a lot of people started calling him Cupcake on social media. Our social media here is insane. And that's how he became President Cupcake when he became the
love
president.
it.
It's horrifying for me that he actually accepts it and responds to it. Like he's completely forgotten the salacious background to where this
Yeah.
whole thing came from.
That's so brilliant. So he's having a little fling with some younger lady. He's Cupcake affectionately, and he now happily responds to, "Hey, Cupcake, how's it going?"
Yeah, so now he's President Cupcake, and we all call him Cupcake, and we tweet about Cupcake, and it's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, when we had COVID, we used to have these national broadcasts that we used to call family meetings, and he would come on the national broadcaster and give this is South Africans. This is who we are.
I love it. I love it. Now listen, let's go from Cupcake to the White House. So tomorrow is this major meeting. It's a really big deal. Tell me why South Africa is so important and the relationship with America and the complexities and all the various bits and pieces that are going on. Because when we chatted last week, I was agog. I was like, wow, there's so much in this.
So you talked about it in your last podcast, right, with Simon, about South Africa being this place on the continent that is the ultimate kind of trading harbor center, right? And how all the various kind of, over the years, all the various empires have tried. And South Africa remains that to a large extent. We are, depending on who you ask and on what day, we are the biggest economy on the continent. Just don't ask the Nigerians that.
Yeah,
because when they debase their economy, suddenly they are bigger than us. But we are the largest. We are the most sophisticated economy on the continent, and with the most sophisticated banking systems. This is important. Banking systems on the continent. And because of that, we have a very large and disproportionate voice on the continent, as it were, in all sorts of spaces and quite a lot of influence. So South Africa is an important player. If you think about the fact that Africa is 54 countries, basically, right? And so talking to South Africa and having South Africa on site geopolitically, given what Trump and China and Russia and Putin and Mr. Xi, all of those things come into play. You spoke a little bit about it when you were speaking with Simon as well, about where does South Africa turn to now that the world is realigning itself politically as well as financially, right? So this is why this meeting is important. But there is also this huge outsized influence that Donald Trump has fallen under, the spell of Elon Musk and some of his big funders who are South Africans by heritage or by, birth. There is all of this talk in America, particularly in the right-wing circles, about what is happening here And as you correctly pointed out, the fact that South Africa essentially is the ultimate DEI experiment, right, for them.
Yes. Yeah, it's the rainbow nation.
We talk about transformation here. It's a very big part of kind of the changeover of the power structures. We talk about how to include a diversified, South Africa is an incredibly diversified country. It's not just black and white. We have 12 official languages here, including sign language. We have a multitude of nationalities who are naturalized citizens and also who have heritage, right? So French Huguenots, Spanish, Jewish, all of that. So diversity is a very big, we are a melting pot. And it's a very big part of who we are. And the idea of a changeover from what was predominantly a white economy, white-driven, white-run economy and political power has had to find a way, a relay race, as it were, to include people who were previously left out of all of those spaces, which is what diversity looks like. It's what employment equity is about. It's a redress. So how do you change that over? And one of the things, the levers that the government put in place, if you were to call it, is transformation agendas. So transformation in terms of employment equity, transformation in terms of quotas in sports, and across every field, essentially, to say, how do we change this over and make it look more like the South Africa you see in the shopping malls? So this is why Donald Trump cares so much about South Africa. But then there is also the issue of the 49, 54, 49, as they call them now, Amerikaners.
Yes, exactly. The refugees.
The Afrikaner refugees who have now gotten an expedited refugee status by executive order from Donald Trump. And last week, as this podcast goes out, we had the first 49 arrive in America, arrive at Dallas Airport, welcomed by very senior members of Donald Trump's administration, waving around flags, essentially saying they are fleeing genocide here in South Africa. They are fleeing laws that have been created to exclude and target them. And this is the story that MAGA and Donald Trump have completely bought, hook, line, and sinker. And what that's created here is it's created from Cupcake being quoted in the newspapers as saying, actually, these individuals have not run from a genocide or from targeted government violence and general violence as a whole, and having their land taken away from them and their intellectual property and everything that they've built bootstrapped without any assistance from any kind of government regime that may have given them a benefit over anybody else, but actually that they are cowards fleeing racial injustice. This is how he was quoted in the paper. Of course, this has created, depending on where you are, if you are on X, major repercussions because very polarized environment. And I think what we've been watching over the past couple of days is possibly South Africa being the first country in the world that is experiencing a targeted misinformation campaign that is being driven through AI, because Grok had a meltdown a couple of days ago.
Yes, no, we've seen all this. We're watching it.
Like all of this, this is the world that we are living in now. There's a reality on the ground, and there is this reality happening on social media platforms and algorithms that don't necessarily match up to each other, but have this influence.
So this is the fascinating thing for me. What we're seeing here is diplomacy and realpolitik on one side. And then you have this fantasy world on the other, which is creating tribes online, which is reinforcing messages. And the explicit gulf is between America and South Africa now. But this is also leading to the fact that the United States has cut off, the White House has cut off all official contact with South Africa over the upcoming South African leadership of the G20. This is a big deal. So
which
South
is
Africa
supposed to be handed over to America. You know this, right?
Yes,
America
I know.
is
So
the next president.
So the Americans have stopped dealing with South Africa, despite the fact that both are in the G20 and South Africa's holding the G20. So this is real stuff. I mean, it might be online, but it's creating real realities. The US aid,
and economic
pulling out of South Africa, all that stuff. I mean, this is a serious targeting of a country.
Or weaponizing of the American might and American money to pressure South Africa, which is a sovereign state, into recalibrating what its politics, its policies, its, what essentially is a state supposedly working for its people. This is a term up for debate. And realigning it to a certain huge power structure that's running a geopolitical game. Because, what is the original sin? Is the original sin that South Africa is cozying up to Russia and China and India with BRICS? Or is it that South Africa has opened this case with ICJ, essentially accusing Israel of genocide? Is it simply the voices in Donald Trump's ear that, in a way, I suppose, wishing for a time that they believed was a golden age for people like them, and so wanting to recalibrate for that?
This is the harking back to apartheid South Africa. Or
Yes.
maybe, Pumi, it's all three. So maybe it's all three. So maybe you have South Africa, massive country, the country that can bring Africa together at the international multilateral organizations, the UN, et cetera, right? It has been number one because of the ANC's association historically with the Soviet Union. It's close to Russia. It has been also needs to trade with India, and it's also a theater of expansion for China. And you take all these things together, and what you actually have is an America that is trying to punish South Africa, and tomorrow's meeting may well be the fulcrum of that.
Yeah, and I think, I wonder how in preparation for the meeting, so when I look at the people that are part of the delegation going to this meeting, we have our Minister of Agriculture, who is a DA, because now what we have what they're calling a GNU, Government of National Unity, because in the last general election, the ANC lost support and didn't have a simple majority, 50+1, in order to constitute its own cabinet for the president. And so the two biggest parties, we have 14 parties represented in our parliament here, and 10 of them, I think, have come together in a coalition being led by the ANC and the DA, which up until last year's general election were the official opposition. And they are the two big parties in this government of national unity. And so the cabinet is made up of a number of various ministers from the parties that are participating. So Cyril Ramaphosa is the president with the support of this government of national unity, which is a tenuous kind of unity because they fundamentally are opposed to each other on a number of different things.
Can I ask just one thing? What are the chances tomorrow or in the course of the next few days of a Zelensky moment in the White House where Trump turns on Ramaphosa in public?
Sure. I think, you see, Trump is so difficult to, he is so difficult to predict. So difficult to predict. What I know and have watched is he is also a showman. I mean, just creating that White House, those chairs and everybody around and the cameras, it's like reality TV, right? And he likes the power dynamic, Trump. Likes the power dynamic of being the big man in the room, being in charge and kind of pulling all of these stops. And what we saw with Zelensky is we also saw his deputy president coming into the moment and being quite weird, as it were. But Ramaphosa, on the other hand, is I think, very skilled politician. The kind in Zulu, in Zulu, the saying is he knows how to agree while shaking his head. So it's kind of, because you guys can see me, it's like
Sounds
saying,
like John.
it's like saying yes, 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 yes. Right?
Yeah.
So, and Ramaphosa is that guy. Ramaphosa knows how to be very meek, which is what Donald Trump likes, without giving too much, without saying yes completely, right? So he knows how to win people over to his side. He's a skilled politician. There's no doubt about that. So I don't know if we're going to see a big shouting down of Ramaphosa, a wagging of his finger, and Ramaphosa shrinking away. If you looked at the body language of that Zelensky meeting, I mean, Zelensky was dejected at the end of the meeting. I don't think we're going to see that with Ramaphosa.
Completely ambushed.
I don't think we're going to see that.
You're not going to say that. That's good. And also, he was a negotiator for the ANC years ago. I mean, he's been around this game for a long, long time. But can I ask you finally about this pivot, right? That when I'm down here, what I hear all the time is America and South Africa have been moving away from each other progressively. And on every 50-50 decision about alliances, South Africa has moved away from America. There are lots of talk that South Africa is very close to Iran. Lots of talk that South Africa is close to China because China is the big player in the region. The Americans are in a way retreating from the region. Where do you think South Africa will jump next? Because where South Africa goes, Africa goes.
And this is why South Africa and its voice remain so crucial. I think that South Africa is in a bad place because we've got bad leaders. We have, over the past 15 years, have had bad politics at play. And the politics have conflated with people's individual dynamic and hunger for self-enrichment, which is not a story that is new to the African continent. And I think that the political infrastructure in our country has all but collapsed. So the individuals who should be driving policy and driving where we jump to next are not looking at the bigger picture of what is good for the country or the continent for that matter, but rather what is good for their pocket.
So they're looting the place.
So, yeah. So there's the looting. You spoke in the last podcast about Jacob Zuma and state capture. And the idea was that, and what was sold to South Africans was that, Cyril Ramaphosa is the astute businessman and he will come in and he'll clean it up and sort it out. And, he has not.
It sounds very similar to Trump as well. He's kind of, looting America as we speak.
Absolutely.
While still saying we're draining the swamp, but not sure if I'm the biggest creature in the swamp.
Exactly.
Look at how much money his children have made. Look at how much money his children have made in this first 3 months of his presidency, right? So we really are in a terrible position as a country in that the guardrails have fallen off and the car's hurtling down a particular path. And it's difficult to tell which way it's going to break. I think compounded by what the GNU has become, because and this is why I think Cyril Ramaphosa has been an astute politician, is by co-opting the DA into his government, they are now unable to be the bulldogs against his policies, against what the ANC wants. And you see them in the U-turn of some of the pronouncements that they've made over the past couple of months. I think that China and Mr. Xi have played a long game of 3D chess with America and have essentially broken the back of what old school classical capitalism is by having subsidized their manufacturing capacity with slave wages, basically, and keeping people out of any real form of decision making or policy driving or having a voice in the way that the government works. And they are playing a long game with South Africa because South Africa is important. South Africa is important. And the Chinese have played that 3D game in the way that they have invested in Africa. So, they put in some money, and they were the first ones with the Tazahara line, the Zambia to Tanzania rail. They've put in a lot of money in Kenya, in Mozambique, in the ports. And Trump has played into their hand by not just the tariffs with China, but by weaponizing their aid and the money that they have and they use on the continent. And by withdrawing it, what he's done is he's made Africans, not just South Africa, but Africans across the board to go, is this guy our friend? Is this guy our friend? And if he is not our friend, who else can be our friend? Putin has some play. I think Putin, unfortunately, has been distracted with the war in Ukraine. He has some play if we look at Burkina Faso and how close he's become with Traore, with the general there, and access to quite a lot of rare earth minerals sitting in that space. So Putin is making play. Putin is using what Russia has always used as a long game. So might and weapons and power. So I'm sorry, guys. I don't have an answer of where it's going to break, but that's what it looks like.
Well, listen, Pumi, this has been really insightful because it is so hard to get a grip on all the various different constellations that are moving at the same time here. It's just my experience down here has been of a country in massive internal and external transition. And at least we've got some flavor of that transition from this conversation. And it's been wonderful. Pumi Mashigo, thank you so much for chatting to us today.
Wonderful. Thank you guys for having me. I love your podcast. It's so much fun.
Cupcake. It's great, isn't it?
Fantastic. Cupcake and the Orange Whip are going to meet tomorrow. And I wonder though, Mac, I mean, you asked the question there earlier. I wonder, will it be another Zelensky moment? Because that was driven by J.D. Vance. So I wonder.
Well, I just think there is a risk. There's certainly, the people I spoke to down here said there is a risk of just an event, a moment, which they don't want. And of course, you didn't say thank you. So what they're saying is American aid is American money that has been going to Africa.
Or if he turns up in his traditional clobber as well, that might cause an issue.
Yeah, I know. But I think the traditional clobber will be a suit and tie for him here. But it is fascinating because it brings into stark relief what is at stake geopolitically at the moment. So you have America actively turning against Africa and pushing the Africans away. And this is the theme of lots of the discussions I've been at this weekend, is a post-American Africa. You have India, which has always had interests in Africa and has always been slightly anti-American.
Yeah.
Why? Because the Americans support the Pakistanis, and of course the Pakistanis are India's implacable enemies. You also have India supporting Russia, or at least tacitly supporting Russia. And of course, in the back of the whole thing, John, you have China, which is basically rebuilding. It's Africa's biggest trade partner. It's its biggest investment partner. It's building infrastructure here. It is deeply enmeshed in the African economy. And of course, it's just sitting on the sidelines watching everything.
You know, Pumi touched on this earlier on about the whole idea of how the US are playing this. And when Trump has disbanded US aid, that obviously has a major effect in South Africa, but the continent as a whole. And it's going to force Africa as a continent, how many, 54 nations?
54 nations.
Yeah, away from America and away from the West. And South Africa are already members of BRICS, But does this mean, like you've always said before about BRICS, is up until recently more of a talking shop? Is this now a time for BRICS to show its mettle and come into its own?
Well, I think it's a really good question, John. And maybe you were ahead of the game on BRICS, my friend. You were ahead in the game of BRICS because
Always.
what we're always ahead of the posse. But I think what we're seeing is if we are seeing the end of multilateralism, okay, the multilateralism that defined Europe since the Second World War and American relationships with the rest of the world, because the Americans would move through the United Nations, the World Health Organization. The
Yeah.
Americans have pulled out of the World Health Organization, pulled out of the world climate change discussions.
Yeah.
We're always undermining the United Nations at this stage. You say it's a talking shop. So, of course, then those institutions become less powerful. And what replaces them are bilateral relationships between countries. And a new bilateral relationship is the BRICS, right?
Yeah.
And of course, South Africa hosts the G20 in November, which the Americans are threatening to boycott, okay, which is extraordinary. And they're members, as you say, of BRICS. So, of course, the flow of cash will probably be much less from America now and much more likely to be from Asia.
Yeah.
And that is what is at stake tomorrow. And one final little bit of the equation is Israel. The global south is 100% supporting of the Palestinians. There
Mm.
is no dissent. The South Africans have prosecuted the case in the International Court of Justice. The Israelis, of course, are depending on the Americans for the insurance policy, which is basically given the Israelis cover to do whatever the hell they like in Gaza. And this is inflaming not just the South Africans, but also the Chinese.
Yeah.
The Russians cynically use the Palestinians for their own good, but the South Africans really believe in Palestine. This is a nation of oppressed people. This is a nation that suffered apartheid. This is a nation that knows what humiliation is to have your
Mm.
land robbed, to have your language dismissed, to have your culture attacked. They understand and feel the Palestinian hurt more than anybody else.
Mm.
You throw that all into the mix, John, and what we have is at the moment when maybe Africa pivots for the first time since the end of the Second World War away from the West and into the arms of China and countries that are adjacent to and aligned to China. And that's a big change.
For sure.